Is this some kind of joke? The guard's voice cut through the quiet morning air like a blade, sharp and impatient, echoing across the polished stone entrance of Arlington National Cemetery as a black motorcade rolled slowly up the distant hill, flags hanging at half-staff in the stillness. And standing just beyond the checkpoint was Arthur Hayes, a thin old man in a worn charcoal suit that had seen better decades. His shoes scuffed but clean, his posture neither proud nor weak, simply steady, as if he had stood in far more difficult places than this and learned long ago that stillness carried more weight than argument. But to the two young guards blocking his path, Corporal Jason Reed and his partner, he was nothing more than a disruption, an inconvenience in a day that demanded perfection. "Invitation only, sir," Reed said again, folding his arms across his chest with rehearsed authority, his polished boots crunching lightly against the gravel as he stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Arthur and the gates. Behind them, the quiet hum of arriving officials grew louder, black sedans gliding in with tinted windows and silent purpose. And yet Arthur did not move, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the guards, but beyond them, toward the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance like a horizon of memory. "You're going to need to leave," the second guard added, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth as if the situation amused him, as if this frail old man had somehow wandered into a place far above his station. But Arthur remained silent, his hands resting loosely at his sides, the wind tugging faintly at the edge of his jacket, and that silence seemed to irritate them more than any argument could have. "Sir, I'm not going to ask again," Reed pressed, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of a few nearby attendees, their quiet conversations faltering as eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. A ripple of curiosity spreading through the gathering crowd of officers, officials, and grieving family members, all dressed in black, all expecting solemn order, not confrontation, and still Arthur did not move, did not protest, did not explain, until finally, with a voice low and steady, he spoke. "I'm here for General Caldwell." The words simple, almost weightless, yet they seemed to hang in the air. Longer than expected, Reed let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if he'd heard something absurd. "Right," he said, glancing at his partner. "And I suppose you're on the guest list too." A few quiet chuckles followed from those close enough to hear, the tension shifting from discomfort to mild ridicule. But Arthur's expression did not change, not even slightly, his gaze drifting once more toward the distant ceremony site, where uniformed honor guards stood in perfect formation, their silhouettes sharp against the morning light. And for a brief moment, something about that stillness, that unwavering focus, created a flicker of unease that Reed could not quite explain, but it passed quickly, replaced by irritation. "Look," Reed said, stepping closer, lowering his voice to something firmer, more controlled. "You're interfering with a state funeral, and if you don't turn around right now, I will have you escorted off the property." The words carried the weight of authority, or at least the attempt at it. And yet Arthur did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply stood there, quiet as stone, as if the noise around him existed on a different plane entirely. And somewhere in the distance, a bugle note began to rise, soft and haunting, carried on the morning air, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. And still, at the gate, the standoff remained, suspended between impatience and something deeper that no one there had yet recognized. The bugle note lingered in the air, thin and haunting, as if the morning itself was holding its breath. And for a moment, even the guards seemed uncertain, their rigid posture softening just enough to reveal the inexperience beneath the uniform. But it did not last. Corporal Reed straightened, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the approaching motorcade now less than 100 yards away, the polished black vehicles reflecting the pale sky. "That is your final warning, sir," he said, his voice dropping into something colder, more official, as if rehearsed in training rooms far removed from moments like this. "You are not authorized to be here." Arthur Hayes finally shifted his gaze, not hurried, not defensive, simply turning his head to meet Reed's eyes with a calm that felt out of place in the rising tension. And there was something in that look, something steady and unshaken, that made Reed hesitate for half a second before pushing forward. "Do you have identification?" Reed demanded, extending a gloved hand. and Arthur reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket, his movements deliberate, careful, as though each action carried a weight unseen by those around him. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, its edges softened by time, and handed it over without a word. Reed took it, flipping it open with a dismissive flick, scanning the contents with a practiced impatience. "Arthur Hayes," he read aloud, his tone flat, unimpressed. "No military credentials, no invitation, nothing that says you belong anywhere near this ceremony." He snapped the wallet shut and pressed it back into Arthur's hand with unnecessary force. "This is a restricted event, not a public tour." A few members of the gathering crowd shifted uncomfortably now, the earlier curiosity giving way to a quiet tension that settled like a low fog, because something about the exchange did not feel right. But no one stepped forward, no one interrupted, and the weight of authority held them in place, just as it always did. Lieutenant Mark Ellis approached then, his uniform crisp, his stride confident in the way of someone newly given command. "What is the delay?" he asked sharply, his eyes moving from Reed to Arthur in a quick, dismissive assessment. Reed gestured toward the old man. "Claims he is here for the general." Ellis let out a short breath through his nose, the faintest trace of a smile, appearing as if the situation bored him. "Sir," Ellis said, addressing Arthur directly now, his tone polite on the surface but hollow underneath. "This ceremony is attended by senior officials and family members only. If you have no official documentation, you need to leave immediately." Arthur's voice came again, quiet but unwavering. "He asked me to be here." The simplicity of the statement seemed almost out of place against the rigid formality of the moment. Ellis tilted his head slightly, studying him as if deciding how much patience to extend. "And how exactly did a 4-star general personally invite you?" he asked, the skepticism clear, a faint ripple of restrained amusement passing through a few nearby listeners. Arthur did not answer right away, his hand drifting briefly to the lapel of his jacket where a small, dull piece of metal was pinned, barely noticeable against the fabric. Ellis followed the motion, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stepped closer. "What is that?" he asked, reaching out before Arthur could respond, his finger brushing against the small object with a casual disregard. "Some kind of keepsake," he added, his voice edged with quiet mockery. The metal shifted under his touch, catching a sliver of morning light, worn, uneven, almost meaningless to anyone who did not know its story. And for the briefest moment, as Ellis's finger lingered there, something in Arthur's expression changed, not outwardly, not enough for most to notice, but deep behind his eyes, something stirred, something old and heavy, like a memory waiting just beneath the surface, and the air between them seemed to tighten, subtle but undeniable, as if the moment itself was about to reveal more than anyone present was prepared to understand. The instant Lieutenant Ellis's finger made contact with the small piece of metal, the world seemed to narrow around Arthur Hayes, the distant murmur of the crowd fading, the low hum of engines from the motorcade dissolving into something older, something carried not in sound but in memory. And for a fraction of a second his breathing slowed, steady and measured, as if guided by a rhythm long ingrained. The cool morning air of Arlington replaced by a heavy, humid stillness that clung to the skin, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant smoke. And though nothing outwardly changed to those watching, Arthur's eyes no longer saw the polished stone gates or the rigid lines of uniforms. They saw a younger world, a younger man, standing in a place where the ground was uneven and the air pressed close, where voices were quieter but carried more weight, where decisions were made in moments that stretched into lifetimes. And in that memory, a young officer, his face tense but determined, looked at Arthur not with authority but with trust, a trust that had not been earned through rank but through something deeper, something forged in shared silence and impossible choices. And in that moment the small piece of metal had not been dull or insignificant. It had been handed over with a steady hand and a voice that carried both exhaustion and certainty. "If we make it out of this," the young officer had said, "you keep this, not because it is official, but because it means you were there when it mattered." And the memory lingered just long enough to leave its mark before the present returned, sharp and immediate, the weight of Lieutenant Ellis's finger still resting against the pin, his expression unchanged, unaware of the shift that had just passed through the man in front of him. "It does not look like much," Ellis remarked, his tone light, dismissive, as he flicked the edge of the metal slightly, causing it to sway against the fabric. "You are going to need more than that to convince anyone you belong here." A few quiet laughs followed from nearby, the tension easing just enough to allow mockery to take its place. But Arthur's hand moved then, not quickly, not aggressively, simply lifting to gently push Ellis's hand away from the pin, his touch controlled, precise, and the movement carried a weight that caused Ellis to pause. "Just for a moment, do not touch that," Arthur said, his voice still low, but now carrying something different, something that settled into the air like a warning spoken without force. And the subtle shift did not go entirely unnoticed. Standing several yards back, partially obscured by the gathering crowd, Captain Daniel Brooks had been watching the exchange from the moment it began. His posture relaxed at first, arms loosely at his sides. But as the conversation unfolded, something about the old man's stillness had begun to draw his attention. It was not defiance, not fear, but something else entirely, something Brooks had seen before in places far removed from ceremonial grounds. A quiet composure that did not seek recognition yet could not be ignored. And when Arthur spoke those 4 words, Brooks felt a faint tightening in his chest, a recognition he could not immediately explain. Ellis, however, seemed more irritated than affected, his brows narrowing slightly as he took a half-step forward, reclaiming the space he felt had been challenged. "You do not give orders here," Ellis said, his tone sharpening, the edge of authority returning as he gestured subtly to the guards beside him. "You are trespassing, and I am about to have you removed." Reed shifted his stance, preparing to act, his earlier hesitation replaced by a renewed sense of duty. But as he reached out, Brooks took a step forward from the crowd, his voice cutting in just enough to interrupt without drawing full attention. "Lieutenant," he called, his tone controlled but firm, and Ellis turned slightly, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Captain?" Ellis asked, impatience threading through his words. Brooks did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on Arthur for a brief moment longer, studying the way he stood, the way he had absorbed every insult without reaction, the way his gaze remained steady even now, and something about it did not align with the situation unfolding. "You might want to verify this before escalating," Brooks said carefully, choosing his words with precision. Ellis exhaled sharply, glancing back at Arthur as if weighing whether the suggestion was worth the delay. And for a moment the tension hung again, stretched thin between action and hesitation, while in the distance the motorcade came to a slow, deliberate stop, doors beginning to open, the ceremony inching closer to a moment that would not wait. And yet at the gate, something unseen had already begun to shift. Lieutenant Ellis held Captain Brooks's gaze for a moment longer than necessary, the irritation still present, but now edged with something more cautious, as if the interruption had introduced a variable he had not planned for. And behind them the soft thud of car doors closing echoed faintly across the grounds, signaling the arrival of high-ranking officials whose presence demanded precision, not uncertainty. Ellis exhaled slowly, straightening his posture as he adjusted the front of his uniform. The movement controlled, deliberate. "There is nothing to verify," he said, though his voice no longer carried the same absolute certainty as before. "He has no credentials, no invitation, and he is delaying a federal ceremony." Brooks did not step back, his expression calm but intent. "Then it will take 30 seconds to confirm that," he replied, his tone even, not confrontational, but firm enough to resist dismissal. And that was the moment the balance shifted, subtle but real, because Ellis now had a choice: escalate and risk being wrong, or pause and risk appearing uncertain, and neither sat comfortably with him. Reed glanced between them, waiting for direction, the earlier confidence replaced by a quiet tension that settled into his shoulders, while Arthur Hayes remained exactly where he had been, unmoved, his hands relaxed at his sides, his eyes once again fixed beyond the gate, as if the conversation unfolding around him existed at a distance he had already accepted. Ellis turned slightly, lowering his voice just enough to keep the exchange contained. "Captain, you are overstepping," he said, but the words lacked the sharpness they might have carried moments earlier. Brooks met them without hesitation. "Respectfully, sir, I believe we already have." There was no accusation in the statement, only a quiet implication that hung in the air between them, and for a brief second, Ellis said nothing. The distant sound of footsteps approaching from the motorcade growing clearer. The measured rhythm of polished shoes on gravel. The ceremony moving forward whether they were ready or not. Ellis finally nodded once, short and decisive, as if convincing himself more than anyone else. "Fine," he said, turning slightly toward Reed. "Get verification on Arthur Hayes." The name sounded different now, no longer dismissed outright. Reed hesitated, just a fraction, before reaching for the radio clipped to his shoulder, his fingers brushing against it with a faint tremor that betrayed the shift in atmosphere. He pressed the button, his voice steady but lower than before. "Command, this is Gate Alpha, requesting identity verification on a civilian. Name Arthur Hayes." The response did not come immediately, only a faint static that crackled through the speaker, stretching the moment longer than anyone expected. The crowd nearby had grown quieter, conversations fading as more eyes turned toward the checkpoint, drawn not by spectacle but by the subtle tension that had begun to ripple outward. Brooks stepped back slightly, giving space but not disengaging, his attention fixed on the exchange as if waiting for something he could not yet name. Arthur remained still, the wind lifting faint strands of his silver hair, the small piece of metal on his lapel catching the light once more, unremarkable to most, yet now carrying a weight that had begun to press into the edges of the moment. The radio crackled again, a voice beginning to respond, clipped and professional, but Reed raised a hand slightly, as if bracing for what might come next. Ellis stood rigid, his jaw set, his eyes no longer dismissive but focused, and somewhere beyond the gate, the honor guard shifted in perfect unison, rifles moving with precise synchronization as the ceremony prepared to begin, unaware that just outside its boundary, a single name had begun a chain of events that could not be undone. And in the silence that followed, before the answer came through, Captain Brooks felt it clearly now, that same quiet certainty he had recognized earlier, not loud, not forceful, but undeniable, like a current running beneath still water. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the question was no longer whether the old man belonged there, but what would happen if he did. The radio crackled once more, sharper this time, and every eye within earshot seemed to lock onto the small device in Corporal Reed's hand, as if it had suddenly become the center of gravity for the entire scene. "Gate Alpha, say again the name." The voice on the other end replied, calm but now carrying a faint edge of attention that had not been there before. Reed swallowed subtly, adjusting his grip on the radio as he glanced briefly at Lieutenant Ellis before answering. "Arthur Hayes," he repeated, slower this time, more deliberate, as though the name itself required precision. There was a pause, longer than the first, not empty but filled with something unspoken, a shift in tone that even those unfamiliar with military channels could feel. Static hummed softly, stretching the seconds into something heavier. Ellis's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned just enough to hear the response more clearly. Brooks remained still, his focus fixed entirely on Reed. While Arthur Hayes stood unchanged, the faint breeze brushing against his jacket, the small metal pin on his lapel catching the light again in a brief, quiet glint, the voice returned. But it was different now, no longer routine. "Stand by," it said, and then the line went silent. Reed lowered the radio slightly, confusion flickering across his face. "Stand by," he repeated under his breath, as if trying to process what that meant. Ellis frowned, impatience returning, but now tempered with uncertainty. "Stand by for what?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. And for a moment, nothing happened. The world did not stop. The ceremony continued to assemble in the distance, officers stepping into position, the honor guard aligning with flawless precision. But at the gate, time seemed to stretch, held in place by a single unanswered question. Brooks exhaled slowly, his instincts sharpening. That brief exchange on the radio had confirmed what he already suspected. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding. Ellis turned back toward Arthur, his expression tightening, as if trying to reassert control over a situation that had begun to slip beyond his grasp. "If this is some kind of attempt to delay proceedings," he began, his voice firm but lacking the earlier bite. Arthur did not respond, his gaze steady, distant, As though he had already heard every version of that accusation before, Reed lifted the radio again instinctively, as if expecting it to speak on its own, and then it did. A sharp burst of static cutting through the air, followed by a new voice, deeper, more authoritative. Gate Alpha. Confirm visual on Arthur Hayes. Reed straightened immediately, his training overriding his confusion. Affirmative. He replied quickly, his voice snapping into formality. Elderly male, approximately 5'10", gray hair, civilian attire. Another pause, shorter this time, and then the response came, precise and unmistakable. Maintain position. Do not remove him. Repeat, do not remove him. The words landed with a weight that seemed to ripple outward. Reed blinked, the instruction. Catching him off guard, "Sir," he began, glancing at Ellis, unsure how to proceed. Ellis's jaw tightened, his authority now directly challenged by a voice he could not see. "Identify yourself," Ellis said sharply, stepping closer to the radio, as if proximity could restore control. The reply came without hesitation. "This is Colonel Harris, Pentagon liaison. You will hold that position until further instruction." The name alone was enough to shift the ground beneath them. Ellis's posture changed. Not visibly to the untrained eye, but enough for Brooks to notice, a slight straightening, a recalibration, the chain of command asserting itself in a way that could not be ignored. Reed lowered the radio slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to caution. The crowd nearby had fallen completely silent now, the subtle drama no longer hidden, whispers fading into stillness as the weight of the moment settled in. Brooks took a step closer again, his voice low, almost measured. "Lieutenant," he said, not as a challenge, but as a reminder. Ellis did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on Arthur Hayes, studying him with a new intensity, as if seeing him for the first time, not as a disruption, but as a question he did not yet have the answer to. And Arthur remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, calm, unmoved, his presence no longer ignored, but not yet understood. While beyond the gate, the ceremony waited, and somewhere far above the quiet tension of the moment, a decision had already begun to move through the ranks, unseen but inevitable, like the first distant roll of thunder before a storm. The words from Colonel Harris did not fade when the radio went quiet. They settled into the air like a command that could not be undone, and for a moment no one moved. Not Reed, not Ellis, not even the small cluster of onlookers who had drifted closer under the quiet pull of tension. The entire scene held in a fragile stillness that felt far removed from the structured precision of the ceremony unfolding just beyond the gate. Lieutenant Ellis exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but deliberate, as if resetting himself, recalibrating the situation now that the boundaries had shifted beyond his immediate authority. His eyes moved once more to Arthur Hayes, but this time the assessment was different, no longer dismissive, no longer casual. It was careful, searching, as if he were trying to reconcile the image of the man before him with the response that had just come through the chain of command. "You will remain here," Ellis said finally, his voice measured, each word chosen with intent. No longer sharp, but no less firm. Reed stepped back half a pace instinctively, creating space where there had been none before, the invisible line between enforcement and uncertainty becoming visible in the shift of his stance. Arthur did not acknowledge the change, not outwardly. His posture remained the same, quiet, grounded, his gaze still fixed beyond the gate where the honor guard now stood fully assembled, their uniforms immaculate, their movements synchronized with a precision that spoke of discipline shaped over years. And yet, for all that order, something unseen had already begun to ripple beneath it. Captain Brooks watched closely, his instincts now fully engaged. The name Arthur Hayes had not just been acknowledged, it had been recognized. And in his experience, recognition at that level did not happen without reason, the kind of reason that did not announce itself until it was too late to ignore. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, his attention flicking briefly toward the road where the motorcade had come to a complete stop, doors opening in sequence, aides stepping out first, scanning, coordinating, the choreography of high-level movement unfolding with quiet efficiency. And then, something changed, subtle at first. One of the aides paused mid-step, his hand lifting toward his ear as if receiving new information. his posture tightening just enough to signal that whatever he was hearing had altered the script. Another aide turned, exchanging a brief glance, a silent communication that passed between them with practiced ease, and within seconds, the flow of movement adjusted, not halted, but redirected. Ellis noticed it too, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked the shift. The ceremony was still proceeding, but something within it had been interrupted, something that did not align with the expected sequence. Reed followed his gaze, confusion returning as he tried to understand what he was seeing. The vehicles remained in place, but the individuals stepping out were no longer moving directly toward the ceremonial grounds. Instead, one of them turned, speaking quickly into a device, gesturing back toward the gate. And that was when the first ripple of awareness spread through the nearby crowd. Conversations that had resumed quietly now faltered again, heads turning in unison toward the approaching figure, a senior officer, his presence unmistakable even at a distance, not because of any overt display, but because of the way others responded to him. The subtle straightening of posture, the instinctive adjustment of stance, the unspoken recognition of rank. Brooks felt it before he fully saw it. That shift in atmosphere, the kind that did not announce itself with sound, but with silence. Ellis stood straighter now, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a more rigid formality. Reed mirrored the change, his shoulders squaring as his grip tightened briefly on the radio. Arthur Hayes did not move, not even as the figure began to approach, step by measured step across the gravel path, the distance closing with a deliberate pace that seemed to draw the entire scene toward a single point. And as the seconds passed, the weight of expectation grew heavier, pressing into the stillness, until it became clear to everyone present that whatever had begun with a simple request for identification had now become something far greater, something that was no longer contained at the gate, but moving toward them with quiet, undeniable authority. The approaching officer did not raise his voice, did not quicken his pace, and yet with every step across the gravel path the atmosphere tightened, the quiet hum of conversation dissolving into a stillness that spread outward like a ripple across water. His uniform bore the unmistakable insignia of a senior command position, the kind that did not need introduction, and as he drew closer, those who recognized it adjusted instinctively, back straightening, shoulders aligning, conversation stopping mid-sentence. Lieutenant Ellis felt it before he consciously registered it, that shift in gravity, and his posture snapped into a sharper formality, his earlier authority now replaced by something more measured, more cautious. Corporal Reed followed suit, his boots aligning, his gaze forward, the radio now held still against his chest, as if even its presence required discipline. Captain Brooks stepped slightly to the side, clearing the path without needing to be told, his eyes tracking the officer with quiet focus. The man stopped just short of the gate, his gaze moving briefly over Ellis and Reed before settling on Arthur Hayes. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, not recognition in the usual sense, not surprise, but something deeper, something that carried weight beyond rank or protocol. The officer's expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the controlled neutrality giving way to a trace of something personal, something that did not belong in a formal setting like this. Ellis noticed it immediately. The change was small, but it was enough to unsettle the certainty he had been holding on to. "Sir," Ellis began, his voice crisp, stepping forward to re-establish the chain of communication. "This individual does not have clearance and was attempting to." The officer raised a hand, not sharply, not dismissively, but with a quiet authority that stopped the sentence mid-flow. Ellis fell silent instantly, the interruption accepted without question. The officer did not look at him again, his attention fixed entirely on Arthur, and when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, but carried a weight that settled over the scene like a command. "Mr. Hayes," he said, the name spoken not as a question, but as a confirmation. Arthur's eyes met his, steady as they had been from the beginning, and for a moment neither man moved, the silence stretching, heavy with meaning that no one else present could fully understand. Reed glanced sideways, confusion tightening his expression. Ellis remained rigid, waiting, but no further explanation came. Instead, the officer took a single step closer, his posture shifting in a way that no one expected, not a loss of authority, but a redirection of it. A recognition of something beyond rank. And then, without raising his voice, without creating spectacle, he spoke again. "You should have been escorted inside already." The words landed with quiet force, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Ellis blinked, the meaning not immediately processing, his mind trying to reconcile the instruction with everything that had led up to this moment. Reed's grip tightened slightly on the radio, his earlier certainty now completely gone. Brooks felt it. Clearly now, the shift had completed. Whatever question had existed at the gate was no longer a question. It was an answer unfolding in real time. The officer turned then, his gaze finally moving back to Ellis, and though his expression remained composed, there was no ambiguity left in his tone. "Lieutenant, you will open this gate," he said, each word precise, measured, and absolute. Ellis hesitated, not out of defiance, but out of the sudden realization that he had been standing on the wrong side of something far larger than he understood. The moment stretched, just a fraction of a second too long, before he responded, "Yes, sir." The words came quickly now, the hesitation buried beneath training. Reed moved immediately, stepping to the control panel, his hands moving with renewed urgency as he initiated the mechanism, the low hum of the gate unlocking breaking the stillness. And as the barrier began to shift open, the line that had separated Arthur Hayes from the ceremony dissolved, not with force, not with confrontation, but with a quiet inevitability, as if it had never truly been there to begin with. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the crowd did not watch with curiosity. They watched with something else entirely, something closer to respect, though none of them yet understood why. The gate moved with a low mechanical hum, slow and deliberate, the metal barrier sliding open inch by inch as if even it understood the weight of what had just shifted, and no one spoke, not the guards, not the officers, not the gathered crowd whose attention had now fully settled on the quiet figure stepping forward. Arthur Hayes did not rush, did not acknowledge the sudden change in treatment. He simply walked, one measured step at a time, crossing the threshold that moments ago had been closed to him, the gravel beneath his shoes crunching softly in the stillness, the sound carrying farther than it should have in the silence that followed him. The senior officer who had given the order remained just behind, his posture unchanged, but his presence now felt less like authority and more like acknowledgement, as if he were not leading but ensuring that something long overdue was allowed to happen. Lieutenant Ellis stepped aside fully, his earlier rigidity replaced by a controlled stillness, his eyes following Arthur with a focus that had lost all trace of dismissal. Corporal Reed stood motionless near the control panel, his grip on the radio loosened, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and realization. Captain Brooks watched closely, his instincts confirmed now beyond doubt. The pattern he had sensed had completed itself, and yet the full meaning of it had not yet revealed itself to those around him. Ahead, the ceremonial grounds opened wide, rows of white headstones stretching across the landscape, each one perfectly aligned, each one carrying a story that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. The honor guard stood at attention near the center, their formation flawless, their focus forward, unaware that the quiet disruption at the gate had already begun to ripple toward them. As Arthur moved closer, a subtle change began to take hold. It started with one soldier, barely perceptible, a slight shift of weight, a flicker of recognition that passed across his face before discipline pulled it back into place. Then another, a second set of eyes lingering just a fraction longer than protocol allowed. And then a third, the effect spreading not through sound or command, but through something deeper, something carried in posture, in stillness, in the quiet language of those who understood without needing explanation. The senior officer slowed his pace slightly, allowing Arthur to move ahead, no longer beside him, no longer behind, but in front. And that alone was enough to draw further attention, because in a place defined by hierarchy, positioning spoke louder than words. Ellis noticed it, his mind catching up to what his eyes were seeing, the realization forming slowly, heavily. Reed felt it too, though he could not yet name it. Brooks exhaled quietly, his gaze steady. He had seen this before, not often, but enough to recognize the signs, the moment before something became undeniable. And then it happened, not as a command, not as an announcement, but as a reaction, the honor. guard, one by one, began to adjust, not breaking formation, not stepping out of line. But their posture changed, sharper, more precise. Their attention no longer fixed solely on the ceremony ahead, but drawn toward the man approaching across the open ground. The air itself seemed to shift, the quiet becoming heavier, charged with a sense of recognition that moved through the formation like a current, and still Arthur walked, unchanged, his gaze forward, his pace steady, the small piece of metal on his lapel catching the morning light once more, no longer unnoticed, no longer dismissed, but not yet explained, and behind him, at the gate, those who had stood in judgment only minutes before now stood in silence, watching as the scene unfolded into something far greater than any of them had anticipated, something that had already moved beyond their control, beyond their understanding, and was now approaching its inevitable moment of revelation. The shift reached its peak not with a command, but with a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if every sound on the grounds had been pulled back to make room for what was about to happen. Arthur Hayes came to a stop just short of the central pathway, his eyes settling on the flag-draped casket in the distance, the honor guards standing rigid around it, their posture now sharpened beyond formality, beyond routine. Something in their stillness had changed, something that no longer belonged to ceremony alone. And then, from the far side of the formation, a movement broke the symmetry, subtle at first, a figure stepping forward from among the senior officers, his uniform marked with 4 stars that caught the morning light in a quiet, unmistakable glint. Conversations that had not yet fully died fell silent in an instant, the weight of his presence alone enough to draw every eye. General Richard Caldwell moved with a pace that was neither rushed nor delayed, each step measured, deliberate, as if he were walking toward something already decided long before this moment. The distance between him and Arthur closed steadily, the gravel path carrying the soft echo of his steps, and yet no one dared speak, no one dared move. Lieutenant Ellis felt the air tighten around him, the realization settling in with a force that did not need volume. Corporal Reed stood frozen near the gate, his earlier certainty now replaced entirely by something else, something heavier. Captain Brooks watched without blinking, his instincts confirmed in full, the pattern complete, the truth no longer hidden beneath uncertainty. And as General Caldwell reached Arthur, he did not stop at a distance, did not maintain the formal space dictated by rank and protocol. He stepped directly in front of him, close enough that there was no mistaking the intent. The entire formation held its breath, every soldier, every officer, every witness, caught in the gravity of the moment. And then, without announcement, without hesitation, the general raised his hand in a precise, unwavering motion, the salute sharp, exact, and held with a stillness that carried more meaning than any speech could have delivered. The effect was immediate, like a signal traveling through the ranks. The honor guard followed, rifles steady, posture locked, salutes rising in perfect unison. The ripple continued outward, officers standing at attention, heads turning, conversations ceasing entirely as the scene crystallized into something undeniable. Arthur Hayes did not return the salute immediately. His eyes remained on the general, steady, calm, as if measuring the weight of the moment rather than reacting to it. And then, slowly, with the same quiet control that had defined every movement since he arrived, he raised his own hand, the gesture simple, precise. And when their salutes met, the distance between past and present seemed to close in a way no one else could fully understand. The silence deepened, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of years, of memory, of something earned rather than given. And when the general finally lowered his hand, his voice followed, low, steady, and unmistakably personal. "You made it," he said, the words quiet, but carrying across the stillness with absolute clarity. Arthur held his gaze for a moment longer before responding. "I said I would," he replied, and that was all. No explanation, no elaboration. Yet in those few words, the entire story seemed to exist, unseen but understood. Behind them, the ceremony resumed, but it no longer felt the same. The meaning had shifted, the focus altered, and at the gate, where it had all begun, Lieutenant Ellis stood motionless, the weight of what he had nearly dismissed settling heavily into his posture. Corporal Reed lowered his gaze, The lesson unspoken but permanent. Captain Brooks exhaled slowly, the quiet certainty he had felt now fully realized. And across the grounds, as the flag stirred gently in the morning breeze, one truth remained, unspoken yet undeniable, that respect was never granted by appearance or rank. It was carried in silence, revealed in moments like this, and remembered long after the world had moved on.